The day your faith began to fall silent. No one notices the exact day everything starts changing on the inside. And maybe that's what makes it so dangerous. Because at first it feels like nothing is happening at all. There isn't a clear moment. There isn't a warning. There isn't an obvious turning point. It's something far more subtle than that. And that's exactly why it goes unnoticed. Faith doesn't disappear all at once. It slowly loses strength through small details that, over time, add up to something much heavier than anyone can easily explain. It starts with a prayer that no longer comes from the heart with the same intensity. And strangely enough, that doesn't seem like a problem at first. It just feels like a different day. Then comes that unusual silence during moments that once felt deeply connected. And that's when something begins to shift internally, even if it's not immediately recognized. The reading that once brought peace now feels more like an obligation. And without realizing it, the person continues their spiritual routine while something inside keeps drifting farther away, as if part of them is somewhere else, while still trying to remain present. The most confusing part is that on the outside, almost nothing changes. And that makes everything seem even more normal than it really is. Life goes on. The people around them continue seeing the same person, maybe someone strong, someone who still believes, someone who is still trying. But inside, an invisible process is taking place, and it makes no noise. It simply wears you down. In many cases, this silent beginning doesn't come from one major wound, and that's exactly what prevents people from recognizing what's happening. It grows out of a collection of small disappointments that were never fully understood, a prayer that felt urgent but seemed unanswered, a difficult season that lasted much longer than expected, a spiritual expectation that never unfolded the way it was imagined. And here's something important. Individually, none of these things seem overwhelming, but together, they create an emotional weight that becomes difficult to carry. And that's when something starts changing deep inside, quietly and gradually. Is something wrong with me? Is God still listening? Is this normal, or am I drifting away without realizing it? Most of the time, these questions are never spoken out loud, and that only makes them stronger. They remain trapped in the mind, repeating themselves in silence, creating an inner atmosphere of confusion that grows heavier with time. And the most dangerous part isn't the doubt itself. It's when doubt begins to feel normal. A person slowly becomes accustomed to this state. They learn how to function without feeling the same strength they once had. And that changes everything internally, even when everything externally appears unchanged. They learn how to continue without the same clarity. They learn how to move forward with a heart divided between faith and uncertainty. And this creates a kind of emotional resistance that looks like maturity, but may actually be accumulated exhaustion. At some point in this journey, faith stops feeling like a living experience and starts feeling like a memory. And it happens so slowly that almost no one notices. Something that was once intense, once powerful, once undeniably real, but now feels distant, not because it disappeared completely, but because it became buried beneath the weight of circumstances and a silence that was never fully understood. And this is exactly where the greatest spiritual danger begins. It's not the immediate loss of faith. It's the normalization of distance. When a person no longer feels surprised by the emptiness, something inside has already begun to change in a way that feels irreversible. The kind of pain no one can explain. There is a kind of pain that cannot find words, not because a person doesn't know how to express it, but because every attempt to explain it feels far too small compared to what they're actually feeling. It's a pain that doesn't appear in medical tests. It leaves no visible scars. It triggers no external alarms. And yet, it completely changes the way a person sees their own life. From the outside, everything may seem normal. The routine continues. The responsibilities remain. Conversations happen just like they always have. But internally, there is a heavy silence, as though something essential has been switched off without warning. And the strangest part is that the person keeps functioning. They keep showing up. They keep moving forward. but they no longer experience the same meaning in the things that once mattered. This kind of pain doesn't come from a single event, and that's what makes it so difficult to understand while it's happening. It develops gradually, like an invisible structure being built from small experiences that were never fully processed. A disappointed expectation, an answer that never came, a difficult season that lasted longer than expected. A prayer offered in faith that seemed to be met only with silence. And here's something important. None of these things seem overwhelming on their own, but together they create an emotional burden that becomes increasingly difficult to carry. And this is where the most delicate part begins. This pain doesn't simply require endurance, it requires understanding. The problem is that understanding something that doesn't immediately make sense is exactly what makes it feel so heavy. The mind tries to organize it. It tries to justify it. It searches for a logical explanation, but it doesn't always find answers that are strong enough to calm the heart. And when that happens, something silent begins to take shape inside. The person starts believing that the problem is themselves. Maybe they're too weak, too sensitive, too distant from something that should be simple, and that completely changes the way they see themselves. Because alongside the pain, guilt is born as well. But there's something that very few people realize while they're living through this state. Not every spiritual pain is a sign of drifting away. In many cases, it's the result of an internal process that hasn't reached completion yet. It's as though something is being reorganized within, without the person being able to see what is actually being adjusted. And that creates a strange space, a space between understanding and not understanding, between feeling something deeply and being unable to explain it. During the hardest moments of a spiritual journey, even strong people experience this kind of struggle. Not because they've permanently lost their faith, but because they're passing through a season where old ways of seeing life no longer work, and the new ones haven't fully formed yet. And that in-between space is often the most uncomfortable place to be, because it creates the feeling of standing still while everything around you continues moving forward. But in reality, this isn't stagnation. It's transition. The challenge is that transition rarely announces itself. It's quiet, slow, and difficult to recognize while it's happening. That's why so many people misinterpret this season. They believe they're moving backward, when they may actually be undergoing a deep internal reorganization. God's silence does not mean his absence. There comes a point in the spiritual journey when silence begins to feel heavier than any answer. And in that moment, the mind desperately tries to fill the void with an immediate explanation, even if that explanation isn't true, as though silence automatically means absence. But it doesn't. Throughout countless spiritual experiences and stories, seasons of silence often come before profound transformation. The problem is that while those changes are taking place, the person living through them cannot see what is being built, and that creates confusion. Because when no answer comes, everything appears motionless. But that may simply be a limitation of human perception in that moment, and this is the part that almost no one notices. The waiting affects the emotions, and when emotions are affected, even small disappointments begin to feel much larger than they truly are. The mind starts searching for signs, interpreting silence as an answer, turning the absence of confirmation into certainty that something is wrong. But there's an important distinction here. Silence may not be the absence of action. It may simply be the absence of perception. And that difference changes everything. Many times, what appears empty is actually a process that has not yet become visible. Something is being built at a deeper level, beyond immediate awareness. And it doesn't depend on human anxiety to happen. The challenge is that the mind struggles with what it cannot understand. It wants to accelerate answers, fill in the gaps, jump ahead to conclusions. But not everything moves according to the pace of urgency. And it is within that contrast that internal conflict is born. Externally, nothing changes. Internally, everything begins to be questioned. And this tension between what is visible and what is invisible is exactly what makes this season so difficult to endure. But it is also where a quiet transformation begins. The way silence is interpreted starts to change, and what once felt like abandonment gradually begins to look like part of a process that has not yet fully revealed itself. The spiritual trap that steals strong people. There is a trap that never arrives in an obvious way, and that's exactly what makes it dangerous. It doesn't appear as a major mistake. It doesn't come with a warning. It doesn't create immediate damage. It simply settles in, little by little. And the most concerning part is that it doesn't only affect people who are far from faith. It reaches strong people too. Those who once had conviction, those who once experienced clarity, those who have lived through deep and genuine moments of faith. And it all begins with something simple: weariness. Not merely physical exhaustion, but internal exhaustion, small frustrations that accumulate, long periods of waiting, answers that never seem to arrive. And over time, this creates a type of fatigue that rest alone cannot fix. Because the body isn't what's exhausted. Hope is. And when hope begins to weaken, everything starts changing its meaning. What once felt light becomes heavy. What once felt natural becomes obligation. What once felt like connection becomes an empty routine, and it happens without the person realizing it. Slowly they begin operating on autopilot, and that's dangerous, because everything still looks normal from the outside, while something important is quietly fading away inside. Life continues, but the internal engagement is no longer the same. And little by little, spiritual sensitivity gets replaced by habit. This trap also grows stronger through constant distraction. The mind becomes crowded with information, worries, comparisons, daily pressures. And within all that noise, the inner silence begins to disappear. And without silence, there is no clear awareness of what's happening within one's own life. The problem is that this doesn't happen suddenly. It happens through small compromises. One day prayer gets postponed. Another day reflection is ignored. Moments when spiritual priorities are gradually replaced by immediate demands. And without realizing it, depth gets exchanged for superficiality. Then when this condition settles in, a person begins confusing exhaustion with a loss of faith. They confuse diminished sensitivity with God's absence. But there is a critical truth here. This trap doesn't destroy everything at once. It slowly slows down spiritual life until a person can no longer accurately perceive their own internal condition. Yet even in that situation, signs remain. Small stirrings within, questions that won't go away, unexpected moments of reflection. And those signs do not appear by accident. They reveal that something is still alive within the process. The biblical moment, almost no one noticed. There are passages so familiar that they eventually lose their original impact, and that creates a quiet problem. People read them, but they no longer truly see them. And when that happens, important details go unnoticed. Throughout many of the teachings of Jesus Christ, there is a pattern that quietly repeats itself. While everyone is waiting for direct answers, clear explanations, or immediate solutions, something else is taking place. The focus is not only on the problem itself. Attention is also being directed towards something changing within the person who is observing. And that completely changes the way the situation is understood, because transformation does not begin only through external events. It also begins through the way those events are interpreted internally, and that is something rarely recognized during the first encounter. Only with time does this detail begin to reveal itself. In many of these moments, Jesus Christ does not respond according to the timetable people expect, and that creates discomfort, because the human mind naturally associates need with immediate urgency. But not everything follows that logic. There is a guidance that appears silent, yet is operating on another level, a level that does not depend on human impatience to exist. And this is where almost everyone misses the most important detail. While attention is fixed on what can be seen, something unseen is being reorganized within perception itself. Certainties begin to be challenged. Expectations begin to be adjusted. Interpretations begin to shift without warning. And what first appeared to be an external event begins functioning as an internal mirror. That is profound, because it means the message is not only found in the event itself, but in the impact that event creates within the person experiencing or observing it. And when this begins to be understood, everything changes. The text stops being merely something to read and becomes something to experience. But there is an even more subtle element hidden within this pattern. The silence between one action and the next also carries meaning, and many times, it is within that interval that the deepest work is taking place, even when no one notices. When God breaks pride in silence, there is a kind of change that does not begin with answers, nor with relief, nor with immediate solutions, and that is exactly what makes it so difficult to recognize while it is happening. It begins with internal discomfort, a discomfort that does not come from outside circumstances, but from within. And many times, it emerges precisely when a person believes they are simply going through a difficult season, without realizing that something deeper is being worked on beneath the surface. Pride does not always appear in obvious ways. Often it hides behind self-sufficiency, behind the belief that everything should make sense quickly, behind the need to control the pace of life, and even behind the difficulty of accepting that some things cannot be solved through personal strength alone. And that is exactly where the process begins. When certain situations move beyond your control, when answers do not arrive on your schedule, when doors close without clear explanations, something internal begins to be confronted, not abruptly, but gradually, quietly. The person starts realizing that not everything depends on their own abilities, and that realization creates a powerful internal breaking point, because it directly challenges the illusion of control that supports so much emotional security. In the teachings of Jesus Christ, humility is never presented as weakness. It is presented as openness to transformation, and that openness cannot fully exist while a person believes they already possess every answer within themselves. That is why some seasons of life seem to dismantle everything around us, not as punishment, but as process. Certain internal structures must lose their grip so that something new can be built. And that is rarely comfortable. As long as pride remains in control, the interpretation of the process becomes distorted. Everything feels unfair. Everything feels delayed. Everything feels like a mistake. But when perception begins to change, another possibility emerges. Maybe the problem is not that the world is out of alignment. Maybe the problem is the way the world is being viewed. And this shift does not happen overnight. It is built during the waiting, built during the silence, built during the moments that make no immediate sense. And the more a person tries to regain absolute control, the more life seems to reveal that there is something beyond human ability, something beyond personal strength. And this realization is not meant to produce frustration. It is meant to produce awareness. Awareness of limitations, awareness of dependence, awareness that not everything must be carried alone. And when that awareness begins to emerge, something within the journey changes direction. The invisible war, taking place inside the mind. There is a battle that does not take place in the external world, and that is exactly what makes it so difficult to recognize. It unfolds within the quietest place of human existence. A war without sound, without scenery, without witnesses, yet one that profoundly shapes the way a person views their own life. This war begins with thoughts that refuse to stop, ideas that continuously repeat themselves, scenarios the mind creates without permission, worries that appear without invitation. And little by little, these thoughts begin occupying so much space that a person can no longer distinguish reality from the interpretation of their own pain. The most dangerous part is that it does not begin aggressively. It begins quietly. One doubt here, another doubt there, a memory that resurfaces unexpectedly, a small concern that grows stronger in silence, and before long the person finds themselves trapped inside a cycle that feels almost impossible to interrupt. This directly affects the way everything is interpreted. Neutral situations begin to appear negative. Small delays begin to feel like signs of abandonment. Moments of silence begin to feel like confirmation that something is wrong. And this happens because an overloaded mind gradually loses balance in the way it interprets reality. Throughout the teachings of Jesus Christ, there is a profound connection between what happens internally and how life is experienced externally. The mind is not merely a place where thoughts exist. It is also a field where faith can quietly be strengthened or weakened without immediate awareness. And when that field enters into conflict, everything around a person feels heavier than it truly is. But that does not necessarily mean destruction. In many cases, it means transition. It is the moment when old ways of thinking begin losing their power, while new ways of thinking are still being formed. And that in-between space is uncomfortable, because there is no complete stability. A person no longer recognizes themselves as they once did, yet they have not fully stepped into the person they are becoming. This intermediate state often produces anxiety, insecurity, emotional confusion, but it also contains tremendous potential for internal reorganization, because it is precisely in this space that the mind begins to be rebuilt. And when that rebuilding process starts, the way life is interpreted slowly changes. What once looked like a threat begins to appear more clearly. What once felt like abandonment begins to be questioned differently, and what once looked like chaos begins revealing deeper patterns. But this transformation is not fast. It is quiet, continuous, almost invisible within everyday life. And the desert is not the end of your story. There comes a season in the spiritual journey when everything around you seems to lose direction. And it doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually. The answers feel farther away. The sense of progress begins to disappear, and life enters a strange rhythm. One where nothing seems to move forward even though everything continues happening. This is the desert, and for the person walking through it, the first impression is almost always the same. The end of the road, a dead end, stagnation, abandonment. Because the desert offers none of the reference points the mind normally depends on to feel secure. There is no abundance. There are no distractions. There are no clear guarantees. There is only what is essential. And that can be deeply unsettling. Human beings naturally learn to measure progress through external signs, visible changes, quick answers, constant confirmation. And when those things disappear, it becomes easy to believe that nothing is happening anymore. But that may simply be an illusion created by perception. Throughout the teachings of Jesus Christ, seasons like this appear repeatedly in moments of transformation, not as punishment, but as spaces where everything superficial begins to lose its power. And when that happens, the things that truly sustain spiritual life begin to emerge. The problem is that this process is not comfortable, because in the desert, a person is confronted with everything that can no longer be supported by appearances, routine, or distraction. Anything that depended on external stimulation begins to weaken, and that creates a void that is often mistaken for loss. But something deeper is taking place. The desert does not merely remove things from life, it removes noise. And when the noise begins to disappear, perception starts to change. The inner life begins speaking more loudly. Old insecurities return. Hidden fears rise to the surface. Questions that have been buried for years begin demanding attention. And this is not disorder. It is exposure. The desert reveals what was hidden. And while that may be uncomfortable, it is also necessary, because no deep transformation ever happens in a superficial environment. There is always a breaking, a reorganization, a rebuilding. And through that process, faith begins to change form. It stops depending on external signs and starts being sustained by something internal, something deeper, something stronger, something more resilient. Yet even then, the feeling of stagnation may remain. And it is within this tension between appearance and process that true transformation begins to reveal itself. What Jesus Christ did during moments of greatest pressure. Whenever pressure increased, the expected reaction would have been panic, urgency, the need to solve everything immediately. But the pattern revealed throughout the teachings of Jesus Christ shows something entirely different. And that changes the way pressure itself is understood. There is a kind of peace that does not depend on circumstances, a steadiness that is not born from the absence of problems, but from a deeper understanding of what is happening beyond what can be seen. While the people around him reacted with urgency, anxiety, or confusion, there was a different posture. It was not avoidance, it was not impulsiveness, it was awareness. And that awareness often seemed strange because it did not follow the normal logic of human reaction. The human mind naturally associates pressure with acceleration. But in this pattern, the answer is not to accelerate. The answer is to remain grounded. And this creates internal conflict for anyone going through difficult seasons. Because when pressure increases, everything inside begins demanding an immediate solution. Thoughts race, emotions intensify, anxiety fights for control. But none of that necessarily produces clarity. Very often, it produces confusion. And it is within this contrast that a profound lesson emerges. Stability does not depend on the absence of problems. It depends on how a person positions themselves within those problems. Throughout the teachings of Jesus Christ, this principle is never presented as something distant or unattainable. It is presented as a deeper way of understanding reality. The goal is not to ignore the problem. The goal is not to allow the problem to define your internal condition. And that requires something difficult. Internal mastery. Mastery over urgency. Mastery over anxiety. Mastery over the immediate interpretation of pain. Because the greatest danger is not the pressure itself. The greatest danger is the decisions made under emotional impact. And when this understanding begins to take root, a person starts viewing their crises differently. What once appeared to be collapse begins to look like process. What once appeared to be chaos begins to reveal itself as internal reorganization. And that completely changes the way life under pressure is interpreted. The truth. Many people discover too late. There is a kind of truth that does not become powerful because it is difficult to accept. It becomes powerful because it only makes sense after the process has already been lived. And that is why so many people take so long to understand it. While they are in the middle of the pain, the waiting, the confusion, this truth feels distant, almost abstract. But eventually it reveals itself with undeniable clarity. Many people spend a large portion of their spiritual lives trying to understand why certain things take so long, why some answers never seem to come, why certain paths appear blocked. And in that constant effort to understand, they overlook something essential that is happening at the very same time. Not every delay is a setback. Not every pause is a mistake. Not every unanswered moment is an absence of direction. And that realization changes everything. The challenge is that the human mind tends to rely on what it can see. And when clear signs are missing, the quickest conclusion is usually that something must be wrong. But that conclusion does not always reflect reality. Throughout the teachings of Jesus Christ, there is a continual dismantling of the idea of immediacy. Transformation is never presented as something instantaneous. Instead, it is shown as a process involving maturity, internal reorganization, and changes in perception before external manifestation ever takes place. And that creates an emotional challenge. Because while all of this is happening, life continues. The person keeps facing circumstances, keeps dealing with limitations, keeps navigating uncertainty, without clearly seeing what is being built within them. And that creates the feeling of stagnation, even when something profound is actively taking place. And this is where many people lose their way. They begin interpreting the process as failure. They start believing they are stuck, forgotten, directionless. And those interpretations begin shaping the decisions they make along the journey. Some people give up too soon. Others change direction before the work is complete. And many only realize later that what looked like delay was actually preparation. There is a kind of growth that cannot be rushed. It does not depend solely on effort. It depends on internal transformation. And that transformation cannot happen at high speed, because it involves deep structures within the mind and the way a person understands life itself. And when this truth is finally understood, something changes in the way the past is viewed. What once felt like wasted time begins to make sense within a much larger process, and what once felt like silence begins to reveal itself as construction, as preparation, as something meaningful that was happening all along. And the miracle begins before the answer arrives. There is an almost natural expectation that a miracle should be sudden, visible, and immediate, something that changes everything at once, something that quickly brings suffering to an end. But in the spiritual life, there is a kind of transformation that begins long before any external change becomes visible. And very few people recognize it when it starts. It begins within. Before the answer appears, something is already being adjusted in the way a person sees the waiting. Before the door opens, something is already being reorganized in the way they deal with silence. Before the solution arrives, something is already being worked on within the structure of the heart and mind. And this is rarely noticed while it is happening, because outwardly, everything looks the same. The same limitations remain. The same questions still seem unanswered. The same waiting continues. But internally, something begins to move. The way a person responds to circumstances starts changing in subtle ways. The intensity of anxiety begins to shift. Certain interpretations lose their absolute power. And even without fully realizing it, the person begins to be shaped from the inside out. Throughout the teachings of Jesus Christ, this kind of inner transformation is never separated from the miracle itself. In many ways, it is the beginning of the miracle, because a miracle is not only the changing of circumstances, it is also the changing of the person living through those circumstances. And that completely transforms the perspective. Because while the human mind often wants to see the solution before believing, the spiritual process frequently unfolds in the opposite order. First comes inner transformation, then comes external manifestation, and that interval can be challenging, because during that season, it may appear that nothing is happening at all, and that perception can create doubt, fatigue, discouragement, the feeling of standing still. But in reality, that very space is where something deeper is being built. The challenge is that this construction does not produce immediate signs. It works at deeper levels, reorganizing perception, maturing emotions, adjusting expectations, and when it finally becomes visible, the external change often reflects something that began inside long before anyone could see it. And this leads to an important realization. The miracle does not begin when everything changes around you. It begins when the way you see life is no longer the same. Why some prayers seem never to be answered. There comes a point in the spiritual journey when silence starts feeling like a negative answer. And that changes the entire experience of waiting. The person continues praying, continues hoping, continues trying to hold on to faith, but the absence of visible results begins to weigh heavily. And little by little, the feeling develops that no one is listening. This is one of the most delicate moments of the spiritual journey, because it directly touches trust. The mind begins searching for quick explanations, trying to identify mistakes, trying to understand what is missing, trying to determine what might be preventing the answer. But not every experience comes with a simple explanation. Throughout the teachings of Jesus Christ, the relationship between prayer and response is never presented as purely immediate. There is a deeper dimension to the process, one in which time itself becomes part of what is being formed, and that changes everything. Because what appears to be an unanswered prayer may actually be an ongoing process of alignment. In many situations, it is not only the external circumstance that must change, the person may also be undergoing preparation for what they are asking to receive. And that is rarely visible at first. During seasons of waiting, the mind often fills the empty spaces with emotional interpretations. Anxiety grows, doubt increases, and perception becomes distorted by the pain of the moment. But something is happening within that interval. Prayer is not only an outward request, it also works within the person who prays, and through that process, internal adjustments begin to take place. Expectations are challenged, emotions are reorganized, perspectives begin to shift, even when the change cannot yet be seen. The difficulty is that outwardly, the experience may still feel like silence. And it is within that contrast that confusion is born, because the mind wants visible evidence to confirm that something is happening. Yet the process often begins from the inside outward. And when that order is misunderstood, the journey is easily interpreted as failure or abandonment. But there is an even deeper reality. Some answers do not arrive at the desired moment because they are connected to internal changes that have not yet finished forming. And until that formation is complete, the answer itself may remain hidden. In the dark night that comes before great change, there are seasons in spiritual life when everything seems to lose its color. And this does not happen suddenly. It happens gradually. Hope feels more distant. Motivation begins to fade. Even the things that once brought meaning seem unusually quiet. It is as though the soul enters a long night, a season where vision can no longer reach what once seemed clear. And this is not ordinary sadness. It carries a deeper form of internal disorientation, a state that causes a person to question not only what is happening around them, but also what is happening within them. And that creates a burden that is difficult to explain to anyone who has never experienced it. Throughout the teachings of Jesus Christ, there are moments when silence and apparent absence of answers become part of a process that reaches beyond immediate understanding, not as abandonment, but as a stage where everything superficial begins to be stripped away. And this is rarely comfortable, because during this phase, a person starts losing internal reference points that once provided stability. Old certainties no longer seem sufficient. Automatic reactions stop working the way they once did, and the way life is interpreted begins to be rebuilt from the inside. During this season, everything appears motionless, but that perception can be deceptive. What is happening is not the absence of movement. It is a type of movement that cannot easily be seen, and that creates internal conflict. The mind searches for explanations, for reasons, for quick answers to fill the emptiness. Yet this very season often refuses to provide immediate clarity, and that only intensifies the uncertainty. But there is a quiet pattern here. Before major transformation, there is often a season of emptying, not because something valuable is being lost without purpose, but because whatever can no longer support the next stage must be removed, and that is rarely recognized while it is happening. Most people interpret it as regression, when it may actually be preparation, and when that understanding begins to emerge, the meaning of the pain itself begins to change. What once felt like emptiness begins to look like transition. What once felt like stagnation begins to reveal itself as process. And within that tension between pain and understanding, something new begins forming deep within. The calling that may be happening. Right now, there is a kind of awareness that does not arrive as a clear voice, nor as a dramatic event, and that is exactly why so many people fail to recognize it when it begins. It appears as an inner restlessness, a persistent sense that something in life needs attention, even when everything seems normal on the outside, and because of that, it is often ignored. This calling does not arrive through sudden upheaval. It does not force immediate decisions. It simply remains, quiet, persistent, as though it is trying to reveal something that has not yet been understood. And because of that, it can easily be mistaken for exhaustion, confusion, or even emotional struggle. Throughout the teachings of Jesus Christ, spiritual guidance often appears not through external pressure, but through internal awakening. It is not a call that forces. It is a call that reveals. And this kind of revelation unfolds gradually, in the middle of daily life, in the middle of pain, in the middle of uncertainty. And that is profound, because the calling does not wait until everything is resolved. It often emerges right in the middle of the process, in the middle of the waiting, in the middle of the confusion. And that is why so many people fail to recognize it at first. They remain focused on understanding what is happening around them, while something much more subtle is being built within them. This calling may appear as questions that keep returning, as an uneasiness that refuses to disappear, as the feeling that life was meant for something deeper than mere routine. And when that calling is not recognized, the tendency is to seek distraction in order to relieve the discomfort. But distraction never removes the calling. It only pushes it into the background, waiting patiently for attention. The most important thing to understand is that this is not random. Experiences like this often emerge during seasons when a person is being internally prepared for something that has not yet become visible. And that creates a quiet turning point. Because eventually, the person realizes that the issue is no longer simply understanding the process. The issue is responding to it. And when that happens, something within the journey stops being observation and becomes decision. When you finally understand that God never left you. There comes a moment in the spiritual journey when understanding does not arrive as an explosion of answers. It arrives as a quiet alignment of everything that has been lived through. And that changes the way a person sees their entire story. The pieces do not change, but the way those pieces are viewed does. Suddenly, what once felt confusing begins making sense at a deeper level. The silence that once felt like abandonment begins to look like process. The waiting that once seemed unfair begins to reveal itself as preparation. And the pain that once felt meaningless begins to uncover a work that could not have happened any other way. Throughout the teachings of Jesus Christ, there is a consistent reminder that care is not measured only by what is felt in the moment. It is also revealed through what is being formed over time. And that is not always visible while it is happening. Because during the process, no one sees the whole picture. They see fragments, isolated moments, disconnected pieces. And because of that, they interpret their story only through what stands directly in front of them. But eventually something changes. Perception matures, understanding deepens, and the way life is viewed begins to reorganize itself. A person realizes they were never truly standing still. Even when they believed they were never forgotten. Even when the silence seemed to suggest otherwise, they were never off the path. Even when everything appeared to point in the opposite direction. And this realization does not erase what was experienced, but it transforms its meaning. The suffering remains part of the story, yet it is no longer interpreted as evidence of abandonment. The waiting was still difficult, but it begins to make sense within a larger process. And what once felt like disconnection begins to look like guidance. And within that understanding, a different kind of peace emerges. Not a peace built on immediate answers, but a peace built on the realization that even in the silence, something was being built. And when that awareness finally settles in, everything that once seemed lost begins to make sense within a greater story of transformation. If this message reached you today, it was not by accident. Not because there is something mystical about this exact moment, but because certain messages only resonate when they meet someone who is already experiencing something similar within. At some level of your story, something is being processed right now, even if it is not yet clear, even if it does not yet have a name. Life does not always speak through immediate answers. Many times, it speaks through processes, through silence, through transformations that only make sense when perspective matures. And perhaps the most important truth in all of this is simple. What appears still is not always still. What appears silent is not always absent. What appears delayed is not always late. Do not lose sight of that in the middle of your struggles. Because even when nothing seems to be happening on the outside, something may be undergoing profound transformation within. May you find strength in the waiting, clarity in the confusion, and stability in the process. And when everything finally makes sense, you will realize it was never neglect, it was construction. If this video helped you in any way, continue seeking content that strengthens your faith and deepens your understanding of the season you are living through. And remember, not everything that is silent is standing still.